I thought I was just inheriting a house, a piece of forgotten land from a grandfather I barely remembered. But what I walked into wasn't a home. It was a history buried under silence, a portrait that refused to stay on a wall, and a legacy built on what we never talk about. This isn't a ghost story. This is what happens when memory is framed, buried, and repainted to erase those we're supposed to love. By the time I discovered the truth, it wasn't just about the portrait. It was about who we choose to remember and who we're taught to forget. It was raining the day the letter arrived, not in torrents, but in that dull, persistent drizzle that seems to wash the world in gray and static, the kind of weather that makes everything feel suspended, like time is holding its breath just long enough for something important to be missed. I remember standing at the window of my apartment, staring out the street below where people moved quickly beneath umbrellas, blurred shapes against a smeared city. I was holding a half-drunk cup of coffee in one hand, burnt and bitter from having sat too long in the pot, and in the other was the envelope, thick, off-white, the kind of paper that crackled when you handled it, as if even it knew it held something heavier than words. My name was written in dark ink, slanted, deliberate, almost like a signature in itself. There was no return address, only a wax seal on the back with a crest I didn't recognize. I hesitated for reasons I didn't yet understand. Opening that letter felt like pulling back the curtain on something too old to touch, too personal to witness. It wasn't until hours later, when the light had drained from the sky and the corners of the room had grown dark, that I finally broke the seal. I should have known then, the moment I read the name at the bottom, Jonathan Vale, that something irrevocable had just shifted. He was my grandfather, though I hadn't seen him since I was 12. My father never spoke about him, not after the fight that cracked our family in half like a fallen picture frame. There were no phone calls, no birthday cards, no visits. For years I had imagined he was already dead, a ghost living in the margins of family stories that were never quite told. And yet here he was, speaking to me from beyond whatever estrangement he'd chosen, through formal words typed on aging paper. To my only grandchild, I leave the Vale estate in full and final ownership. You'll find all details enclosed. That was it. No apology, no warmth, not even a memory offered in place of goodbye. Just a deed, a location, and a legal seal. I sat for a long time with the letter on my lap, fingers numb, mind flooded with strange, fragile mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. Grief, maybe not for him, but for the silence between us. For everything I might have asked if he bothered to stay. For the stories I would never hear. But curiosity was louder than sorrow. The next morning, I took the train out of the city, the letter folded neatly in my coat pocket, like a map, to a place I didn't know how to feel about. The train ride was long and mostly quiet, cutting through forgotten towns and fields that stretched like blankets toward a horizon too pale to touch. I thought about my childhood, the fragments I had of the estate, mostly seen through half-remembered visits and sepia-toned photos in my father's study. There had been a wide lawn, I remembered, and a house that looked like something out of a different century, all gables and stone and long windows that caught the light in strange ways. I remembered a woman, too, but not clearly. Maybe a caretaker, maybe someone else. My memories of her were soft around the edges, like dreams. The town of Merrow Creek was smaller than I expected. One main road, 2 gas stations, a diner with a chip sign that read Marlene's. Everyone seemed to know each other in a way that made outsiders stick out even if they didn't speak. I didn't stop. The directions led me down a winding road through dense trees until the signal on my phone disappeared entirely. The estate emerged slowly, like something coming up from deep water. First the rusted gates, half-eaten by ivy, then the driveway swallowed in moss and silence, and then the house itself. It was bigger than I remembered, colder. The stone was darker than it should have been, the roof sloping into sharp angles that made it look like it was watching me. I stepped out of the car and stood there for a while, letting the sound of the wind fill the space where other voices might have lived. The air smelled like wet leaves and something older, something metallic. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The foyer was cavernous and still. Dust hung in the air like sleep. Everything was exactly where it had probably been for decades. Coats still hung on iron hooks, a pair of shoes by the stairs, a tarnished mirror reflecting a warped version of myself. It was like the house had been paused mid-breath. I moved room to room in silence, each one colder than the last, the floors groaning softly under my steps like they were complaining about being walked on again. And then I saw it. In the main hallway, just above the fireplace mantel, a portrait, large, imposing, framed in what so dark it looked like char. It was a woman. Her eyes were the first thing I noticed, not because they were frightening, but because they were impossibly familiar. Wide-set pale, watching with a kind of sadness that felt intimate, almost invasive. She wore a dark green dress, high-collared, her hair pinned neatly back. No plaque, no signature. Just her. I stared at her for a long time, feeling something I couldn't name coil slowly in my stomach. She was not a stranger. I didn't know how I knew that, but I did. She was woven into something inside me, like an echo from a song I had forgotten I knew. I turned away eventually, trying to shake the feeling. I found the study next. It was as my grandfather had left it, papers stacked in neat piles, books arranged alphabetically. Of course he would do that. He had been a man of rigid order, according to my father, obsessed with control and legacy. The walls were lined with portraits. 2 smaller ones. Family members, I assumed. None of them smiled. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, not yet. Just a bone-deep unease, like I'd stepped into someone else's skin and couldn't quite fit. The wind scraped at the windows, and the house made sounds I couldn't place. Groan sighs, the occasional creak, like someone shifting their weight in a chair just out of sight. I tried to tell myself it was just age, just an old building remembering how to breathe again. But in the dark, I kept thinking of the woman in the portrait, how familiar her face felt, how her eyes didn't leave me even when I walked away. I didn't yet know the portrait would fall, that it would refuse to stay on the wall no matter how tightly I fixed it. I didn't know that my grandfather's silence was the beginning of something else entirely, not just inheritance, but consequence. I didn't know the estate was a story unfinished, but I would, and it all began with that letter, the one that arrived just late enough to make sure I'd never get to ask the questions I didn't even know I had. The morning after my first night in this state, I woke to silence so complete it felt like sound itself had been drained from the walls, as if the house had swallowed everything noisy about the world and decided, instead, to steep itself in its own memories. I lay in the narrow guest bed wrapped in stiff linen sheets, watching the ceiling breathe dust and slow pulses of morning light. The estate was colder than I remembered, though maybe I never remembered it clearly at all. Childhood memories tend to stretch and bend with age, like soft wax held too close to heat. I sat up slowly, every muscle stiff from sleeping poorly, if sleeping at all. The weight of the house was still there, pressing down on me like I was being gently reminded I didn't belong here. Not really. I dressed quickly, wrapped myself in a sweater that still smelled faintly of home, of my real home, the apartment I'd left behind in the city, where traffic hummed outside the window and neighbors banged pots against thin walls. Here, even my breathing felt too loud. I stepped into the hallway and saw the portrait still hanging in its place above the fireplace, and something in my stomach curled again, quietly. I hadn't dreamed it. Then, she was still watching, still waiting. I turned away and began exploring the estate in earnest, wanting, needing, to understand the space I'd been given, this inheritance that felt less like a gift and more like a responsibility I hadn't asked for. The house was massive, far too large for one person. Every room had a purpose once, now forgotten. A sunroom with yellowing drapes, a conservatory with broken panes and dead plants clutching at light that no longer reached them, a formal dining room set for a dinner that never came. Dust clung to everything. Cobwebs like paper lace hung in corners, and the scent of old wood, mold, and something faintly metallic followed me like a shadow. There were a remnant of a life lived here, half-finished crossword puzzles, a cracked teacup left on a side table, a radio set to a static frequency no one had bothered to change. I opened drawers that hadn't seen daylight in years. Inside were ledgers, checkbooks, brittle photographs, and correspondence that hinted at a man obsessed with order, legacy, and something unspoken. My grandfather, Jonathan Vale, had been meticulous to the point of compulsion, and it was everywhere. in the way each book on the shelves was lined up flush with its neighbor, in the careful labeling of storage boxes, in the inventory lists I found tucked in drawers beneath the bed. It was like he feared chaos, feared something slipping out of place. But even with all that order, the house felt wrong. Not haunted. There were no cold spots or creaking footsteps or flickering lights. Just wrong, like a song slightly out of tune. Like something important had been left unfinished. I found his bedroom on the second floor, untouched since his death. The sheets were folded, the bed made tightly. His slippers still rested beside the nightstand. On the dresser sat a silver picture frame turned face down. I hesitated, then flipped it over. A photograph of my father as a boy stared back at me. 10, maybe 11, standing in the same hallway where I'd first seen the portrait. He was smiling, but there was tension in it. The kind of forced joy kids put on when they know they're supposed to be happy. My grandfather stood behind him, hand on his shoulder, and his expression was unreadable. I stared at it for a long time before returning the frame exactly how I'd found it. That afternoon I walked the grounds, needing air, needing something that didn't smell like dust and time. The estate sprawled beyond the house, overgrown gardens, a crumbling greenhouse, paths that led to nowhere and everywhere at once. The trees pressing close around the perimeter, thick and silent, a natural barrier that made the estate feel like an island. The further I walked, the less I heard. No bird song, no rustle of small animals, just the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes and the low sigh of wind through the leaves. It was beautiful in a way that made you ache. At the edge of the property, I found a low stone wall, and beyond it, a plot of land that had once been a garden. Now it was a mass of tangled vines and long-dead flowers. There was a bench there, half-rotted, facing a broken fountain filled with leaves. I sat, breathing in the quiet, trying to understand why I felt so out of place. This was supposed to be mine now, all of it, and yet I felt more like a trespasser than an heir. Maybe it was a silence. Maybe it was a way to being handed something you never asked for, something that carried the gravity of blood and legacy and choices made long before you were born. Back inside, I returned to the hallway and found myself staring at the portrait again. The woman's eyes followed you, not in the cliché way people always say portraits do, but in the way that memory follows grief. Her expression was soft, composed, but there was something beneath it, sorrow, maybe, or disappointment. I didn't recognize her, not truly, but the longer I stared, the more I felt she knew me, like I had failed her somehow, or she had failed me. That night, I tried to sleep again, but the house had grown colder. I piled blankets on top of the bed, yet still the chills seeped through. I heard sounds I couldn't name, not voices, nothing supernatural, just the kind of noises a house makes when it settles or remembers. Floorboards shifting, pipes sighing, wind tracing its fingers across the glass. I told myself it was old age, decay, memory. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the house, despite its emptiness, was watching me back. The portrait fell for the first time the following morning. I heard it before I saw it. The heavy thud of wood hitting floor, a shudder through the air like the house had exhaled. I ran to the hallway, and there she was, the woman's painted face staring up at the ceiling from where it lay on the floorboards, frame cracked at the corner. I stood there for a long time, unmoving. The nail in the wall was still there, unbent. The wire across the back of the frame was unbroken. It didn't make sense. I crouched, lifted the portrait, and carried it to the dining room table. She stared up at me from the canvas, her eyes dark with something I couldn't name. I felt the urge to speak to her, to ask her who she was, what she wanted, but instead I set the painting aside and made breakfast, hands shaking just slightly. After eating, I rehung the portrait carefully, double-checked the supports. It was secure, yet somehow I already knew it wouldn't stay. I couldn't explain why I felt that certainty. It was like a truth buried under my skin, beneath the blood that tied me to this place. Something was wrong here, not in the way people mean when they talk about curses or ghosts, but in the way a house can become a mirror to the people who once lived inside it, in the way grief can root itself in wood and stone, in the way silence can tell stories louder than words. I began writing everything down, starting a journal not because I expected anyone to read it, but because I needed to make sense of what I was experiencing. I documented the layout of the house, the condition of the rooms, the strange stillness in the air. I noted the time the portrait fell, how many seconds it took me to react, the angle at which it landed. It gave me a sense of control in a place that had no use for logic. That night, I dreamed of the woman. Not vividly, not clearly, just her eyes, wide and fixed on mine, and the sound of something brushing against canvas, like fingers smoothing paint. I woke before dawn, sweating. I didn't sleep again. I sat by the fireplace with the journal on my lap, the woman's gaze burning into my back. And for the first time, I wondered not who she was, but why my grandfather kept her there, why he chose her to hang in the most visible place in the estate, and whether she was ever meant to be forgotten at all. There's something that happens when you look into a face long enough, whether it's real, remembered, or rendered in oil, that begins to chip away at your sense of time. I didn't mean to spend so long staring at her. The portrait had been rehung after first fall, carefully and with a kind of reverence I hadn't expected from myself, as if part of me had already accepted her place on that wall was non-negotiable. But I found myself drawn back to her constantly, pausing in the hallway even when I had no reason to pass through it, lingering for minutes that became hours, tracing the lines of her face with my eyes until I could recall behind my eyelids with terrifying clarity. The more I looked, the more I noticed things I hadn't before, the subtle shading under her jawline that suggested tension, the faint upward quirk at the edge of her lips that wasn't quite a smile, the brushstrokes in her eyes that made them seem somehow wetter, more present, like they were waiting for me to understand something I'd forgotten. It became a compulsion, quiet but insistent. I began sketching her, at first just rough outlines on notepads beside my bed, then more detailed attempts late into the night with the help of an old set of charcoals I found in one of the desk drawers. I hadn't drawn in years, not since art school, not since I'd given it up in pursuit of a life that made more financial sense, but the act of recreating her face grounded me in a way nothing else in the house could. It made me feel like I was participating in something rather than simply inheriting it, and yet, with each drawing, I felt like I was getting further from her, as if the portrait itself was resisting my attempts to replicate her essence. No matter how exact my lines, how carefully I rendered her expression, always came out hollow, like a mask of the woman rather than the woman herself. The real version hung on the wall with that soft, aching intensity, watching me work with a gaze that felt increasingly intimate. I began talking to her, not conversationally, nothing so overt, but in murmurs under my breath when I passed by, questions like who were you, and why here, and what did he see in you, as if repetition could conjure memory. I searched the house for answers. I scoured the study again, sifted through drawers in every room, flipped through old photo albums so brittle they threatened to dissolve between my fingers. But there were no labels, no names, no photographs of the woman. It was like she existed only in that single, haunting frame, suspended in time and mystery. I tried asking the locals in town, made a quiet trip to the post office and the small diner, casually dropping my last name to see if it stirred recognition. Most responded with polite neutrality. A few with raised eyebrows, a handful with curiosity muted by something I couldn't quite define. One elderly woman at the diner, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea, stared at me for a long moment after I mentioned Jonathan Vale, then simply said, "That house remembers everything," before returning to her crossword. It wasn't helpful, but it lodged in my mind like a splinter. That house remembers everything. What did it remember about her? I returned home that evening with a strange, restless energy, and when I walked into the hallway, the portrait was gone again. It was lying on the floor, face up, eyes skyward like a drowned body pulled from the river. This time, the nail had bent backward as if pulled with force. I stood there, staring, my throat tight with something between fear and familiarity. I didn't move for a long time, and when I finally lifted the frame, I noticed something I hadn't before, an inscription on the back, faint and nearly hidden by the old mounting bracket. I tilted it toward the light and squinted. For words, for I remember. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, not the elegant script of the letter I'd received, but raw, unfiltered, almost desperate. I ran my thumb over it, heart pounding in a way that made my whole body feel like a ticking clock. Who was M? And who had written the inscription? My grandfather? Someone else? The discovery reignited my search. Only this time I was less careful, less methodical. I tore through the house like a storm, pulling open boxes I previously left untouched, dumping drawers onto the floor, scanning every inch of wallpaper and floorboard for hidden seams or compartments. I knew it was irrational. I knew I was slipping into a kind of obsession that made no sense on paper. But I couldn't stop. It wasn't just about the portrait anymore. It was about understanding why this woman had been immortalized in oil and shadow, why she had been left here for me to find, why no one ever spoke her name. I stopped eating regularly. My journal became erratic, filled with sketches, fragments of thoughts, questions without answers. My dreams grew more vivid. I didn't see her exactly, but I felt her presence, always just outside the frame of sleep, always watching. I tried sleeping downstairs one night, as far from the portrait as possible, thinking distance would help. It didn't. I woke after 3 hours and found myself back in the hallway, staring up at her, barefoot and shivering, not knowing how I'd gotten there. It was then I began to consider something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. Maybe this wasn't about her. Maybe it was about me. About what the house was trying to show me. About what my grandfather had left unsaid. I began to look through a few letters I had from my father, old ones from college, and after searching for anything, any mention of the estate, of a woman, of something unfinished, I found one that stopped me cold. It was addressed to my mother, written years before they divorced, dated 6 months before he stopped speaking to Jonathan Vale altogether. In it, he wrote, I can't go back there, not after what I saw. He said she was a mistake, that it was the only way to protect the family. But he looked like a man who had murdered something precious. And I can't forgive that. I don't want our child near that place. I read it again and again until the words blurred. My hand was shaking. A mistake. Something precious. My father had seen her, known her, and whatever had happened had been serious enough to fracture their relationship forever. My grandfather had called it protection. But from what? Or whom? The portrait's eyes no longer felt like an invitation. They felt like an accusation. I sat on the floor beneath the painting for a long time that night, legs folded, fingers tapping my knees like a metronome. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The silence between us was heavy with things neither of us could say. And in that silence, I began to understand something deeply unsettling. This state wasn't just a home. It was a vessel, a container for truths too heavy to be spoken aloud. And I was no longer just an heir. I was a witness. The woman in the portrait had not been forgotten by accident. She had been painted as a form of memory that couldn't be destroyed. And maybe, just maybe, she was never meant to stay on the wall at all. There comes a point where solitude stops feeling like peace and begins to feel like a sentence, a slow strangling of the self by the quiet you once thought you needed, and that shift crept over me in ways I didn't recognize until it had already taken root in my chest. I had spent nearly 3 weeks alone in this state by then, waking each morning to a house that felt older than it had the night before, its bones groaning louder, its air growing heavier, as if it was beginning to lean in closer, listening to my thoughts, memorizing my routine, and rearranging its silence to match the rhythm of my grief. The portrait had fallen 3 more times. Each time I had found it in a slightly different position. Once flat on its face, another time propped awkwardly against the wall, as though it had landed with strange, unnatural grace, and once, inexplicably, several feet away from the fireplace, the frame chipped where it must have struck the leg of a nearby chair. I had checked everything. The studs in the wall, the mounting wire, the floor for vibrations or tilts, but there was no logical reason for its repeated descent. I stopped rehanging it after the 4th time. I left it lying on the floor in the hallway, face up, eyes skyward like a question too old to answer, and I began walking around it instead of past it, as if I feared stepping too close would draw something out of me I wasn't ready to face. I didn't leave the estate anymore. My car sat under a thin blanket of moss and pollen, the tires beginning to settle into the gravel. I had stopped checking my phone days ago. There was no service out here, and the battery drained quickly in the cold. I ate when I remembered, which wasn't often, and I slept in brief, fractured segments, dreams broken by sounds that always turn out to be wind or old wood or nothing at all. But most of all, I watched. I watched the house. I watched the portrait. I watched myself. I had started avoiding mirrors, not out of fear, but because the version of me looking back didn't feel entirely familiar anymore. My hair had grown wild, my eyes darker, not from any outside force, but from within, like my body was slowly adapting to a kind of emotional environment that didn't allow light to stay for long. And in that dim reflection of myself, I began to see her, the woman in the portrait, not as an invader or mystery, but as a reflection, a second version of something already living inside me. I stopped asking who she was. I started asking who I was, and what parts of my identity had been shaped by this place long before I'd returned. My grandfather's journals had become a fixture in my reading. Though sparse and practical, every now and then I'd find a line that felt like it had been left for me deliberately, like, there are choices we make that echo louder than others. Some rooms hold echoes longer. Or, guilt, if not buried deep, tend to bloom in strange places. They weren't confessions, but they were signals, breadcrumbs laid down by a man who had spent too much time organizing the exterior of his world to avoid the chaos rotting quietly beneath it. I couldn't find any entries that directly mentioned the portrait or the woman, but there were blank pages, sections ripped from spines, entries marked out with careful strokes of black ink, as if erasure was safer than truth. That told me more than words ever could. I began spending more time in the unused rooms of the house, exploring forgotten corners with the kind of reverence one gives a graveyard. The east wing had been sealed off by a locked door I had ignored for weeks, but one night, unable to sleep and nearly shivering from restlessness, I found the key in the back of a drawer in the study, tucked inside a hollowed-out book. The door creaked open with reluctant slowness, revealing a part of the house that hadn't seen light in years. The air was denser here, filled with the smell of paper, dust, and time. The first room I entered was what looked like a sitting parlor, once elegant, now decaying. A piano slumped in the corner, its keys yellowed, its lid warped. On a nearby table, a chessboard sat mid-game, pieces frozen in place, a long-abandoned strategy awaiting a player who never returned. But it was a hallway beyond that room that caught me. There were paintings here, 2, dozens of them. Portraits, landscapes, still lives, some finished, others only half complete. Canvases covered in rough outlines, abandoned brushstrokes, and smudged signatures. And among them, I found a second portrait of the woman, not the same as the one in the hallway. A different pose, a softer expression, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes cast downward. This version of her looked tired, not in a way that pain could fake, but in a way that felt lived. I stood staring at it for nearly an hour, the cold biting through my sleeves, something in my chest tightening with slow, aching pressure. This wasn't just art. This was memory. This was love. Or grief. Or both. Why had my grandfather hidden this version of her away? Why had he chosen the other for display? I sat on the floor across from the painting and whispered questions I knew she couldn't answer. I wanted to believe she had meant something to him, that there was once warmth in her presence. But maybe that's what made her dangerous. Maybe her presence reminded him of something he spent a lifetime trying to forget. I didn't leave that part of the house for days. I brought food, water, blankets. I camped there like it was sacred, watching both versions of the woman, comparing them, trying to triangulate who she had been through what little my family's history was willing to give me. I began dreaming about rooms I hadn't seen, hallways filled with mirrors, doors that led to versions of my own past, only slightly wrong. I started thinking about my father, the silence he'd carried, the rage that simmered beneath it. What had he seen here? Who had he blamed? Why had he never spoken about it again? I began wondering what memory does when you bury it long enough, whether it dies or waits. I hadn't heard my own voice in days. I hadn't spoken to another human being in almost a month. The house became a character I spoke to, softly, respectfully. I apologized when I stepped too hard. I said thank you when doors opened easily. I whispered good night to empty rooms, because it felt wrong not to. This wasn't madness. It was something slower, deeper, a kind of emotional erosion that wears you down in layers. And still, every time I passed the hallway, the original portrait waited on the floor, unblinking. Eventually, I stopped walking around it. I sat beside it. I traced the inscription again. For M, I remember. I repeated it until it no longer felt like language, just sound, just breath. And then I said out loud, just once, 4M, I remember. And I realized with sudden clarity that I wasn't trying to solve a mystery anymore. I was grieving, not just for her, but for every silence passed down through my family, for every name erased from our history, for every story that was never told because someone decided it was too dangerous to remember. And that's when I knew I wasn't losing my mind. I was uncovering it, peeling back everything that had been layered on top of me since I was born. The house wasn't haunted. I was. And the woman in the portrait? She was never meant to frighten me. She was trying to remind me of something that everyone else had tried so hard to forget. I don't remember the exact moment the truth began to take shape, but it started, I think, with a letter I wasn't supposed to find. It was hidden not in some locked drawer or beneath a floorboard, but tucked inside the back of a painting frame in the east wing, folded so tightly it had nearly fused with the wood, as if time itself had conspired to keep it sealed. I only found it because I was cataloging brushstrokes, mad, meticulous work I'd begun after days of poring over the multiple paintings of the woman, counting layers of paint, studying every inch of canvas with the obsession of someone trying to translate a foreign language written in grief. The paper was brittle and yellowed. The ink faded to a coppery ghost, but the signature at the bottom struck me like a hammer to the chest. Miriam Vale. For M. I remember. M. Miriam, the woman in the portrait, wasn't a stranger at all. She was family. But not just family. She was my grandfather's daughter. My aunt. My father's sister. The letter wasn't long. Just a page and a half written in the delicate hand of someone trying not to cry. Father, I don't know how long you intend to keep pretending I don't exist, but the silence is worse than anything you could say. I know I disappointed you. I know you believe what you did was to protect a family name, but how do you protect a name while bearing your own blood? I have lived these years in exile, not because of what I did, but because of how you responded. I love someone you didn't approve of. That was all. I didn't kill anyone. I didn't disgrace you. I simply lived outside your expectation. But that was enough for you to erase me. I miss home, not the house, but the feeling of being seen, of being part of something. I miss him, too, though I know you'll never forgive that. I wonder if you'll ever let me back in. I wonder if the painting you commissioned was your apology or your final goodbye. I don't know which hurts more, but I still remember the sound of the piano on winter mornings. I still remember the smell of Mother's garden, and I remember the day you stopped saying my name. The rest of the page was smeared with water damage, or tears, or time. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the paper. Miriam Vale. The portrait wasn't a lover or a caretaker or some mysterious family friend. It was my aunt, someone my father never once mentioned, someone I'd never seen a photograph of, someone who had been scrubbed clean from our lineage like a stain. And yet here she was, oil and canvas and sorrow, staring at me from the hallway where I had passed her 100 times without knowing. I fell into a chair, the letter clutched in both hands, my breath catching in a strange, ragged rhythm. This changed everything. It wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It wasn't about haunting or legacy or even memory. It was about erasure, about what it means to be removed from the story of your own family. And as the truth unfolded, piece by terrible piece, I realized what must have happened. My grandfather, a man of control and image and rigid values, had cast his own daughter out, not because she was dangerous, not because she had done something unforgivable, but because she had loved someone he deemed unacceptable. Maybe it was class. Maybe it was race. Maybe it was something else entirely. The specifics didn't matter as much as the act itself. He had erased her, not killed her, not physically, but emotionally, genealogically, spiritually. And my father, my quiet, bitter father, had been forced to watch it happen, had lived through the moment his sister was made invisible. And in doing so, he learned the lesson. Speak of it, and you risk being next. I sat in the East Wing for hours, reading and rereading the letter, trying to reconstruct a woman I never met from brushstrokes and fading ink. And the more I thought about her, the more I realized how deeply I'd been affected by her absence. This silence, it wasn't just theirs. It had shaped me, too. My father had passed it down like an heirloom, an emotional stiffness, a fear of naming pain. I thought about all the times growing up when I'd sensed something unspoken in our house, some tension that didn't come from arguments or obvious trauma, but from the weight of what had been withheld. Now I knew, and it broke me. I returned to hallway and sat beneath the original portrait, the one where her eyes were level and searching. I wanted to say her name aloud, to break the curse, to make her real again, but my throat caught on it. Miriam. I whispered it, choked it out, and for the first time since arriving at this state, I cried. Not a few silent tears, but the kind of crying that empties you, that scrapes out your insides, and leaves you hollow in the best and worst ways. I cried for her. I cried for my father. I cried for the legacy I now carried, the privilege and the burden of remembering what others had tried to forget. When I finally slept, I dreamt not of her face, but of her voice. I didn't know what it sounded like, not really, but in the dream, she was singing low, almost humming, something without words, just a melody filled with aching. And when I woke, I felt like something had shifted again. The portrait hadn't fallen that night. It stayed on the wall, watching, but now she felt less like a mystery and more like a presence, not haunting me, but waiting for me to finish something, to restore what had been taken. I spent the next day going through every record in the house, birth certificates, baptismal papers, legal documents. Now that I knew what I was looking for, I found the gaps easily. There was no mention of Miriam in any official file, but here and there were clues, scratched-out names, family photos with one figure cut out or blacked over, letters with suspicious starts like, "My only son," instead of "my children." The omission was methodical, and that made it all the more tragic. This wasn't accidental. It was surgical. My grandfather had erased his daughter from the family's official narrative and then immortalized her in secret. The painting, the second one, the one where she looked tired, resigned, wasn't meant to be seen. It was guilt made visible. A private confession he never voiced aloud. And the one in the hallway? That was punishment. A constant reminder of the price paid for disobedience. I realized something else, too. The condition of my inheritance, though never stated outright, was clear now. My grandfather hadn't left me the estate to live in. He had left it to me as a question, a challenge. Would I continue the silence, or would I undo it? Would I rejoin the fragments, say her name, and let the truth outlive the shame? I knew what I had to do, but I also knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance from what remained of the town, perhaps from relatives I didn't yet know existed, from the history itself, which resists correction the way old wounds resist being reopened. But it was necessary. I wasn't ready to leave the estate. Not yet. There was more to find, more to remember, but now I knew who I was walking toward. Not a ghost, not a symbol, but a woman with a name, a sister denied, a daughter erased, an aunt I never got to meet, Miriam Vale, and I would make sure she was forgotten no more. I found the clause on a rainy afternoon in the smallest room of the estate, a cramped, low-ceilinged office that I had ignored for weeks because its door refused to open fully, blocked by a sagging cabinet swollen with damp. It had taken me most of the morning to force it open with enough care not to damage the frame, and when I finally stepped inside, I was struck by how different it felt from the rest of the house. There was no grandeur here, no velvet chairs or heavy curtains or shelves filled with curated first editions. This was a working space, functional, austere, lined with filing cabinets and ledger books, the kind of room where decisions were made without sentiment. The air smelled of old paper and mildew in the window, half obscured by ivy, let in only a sickly gray light. I didn't expect to find anything of value here, but something told me to stay, to sit at the simple desk and go through every drawer, every file, every forgotten slip of correspondence. Hours passed. Rain ticked against the glass like a clock, tried to remind me how long I'd been listening to silence. And then buried in a folder labeled Estate Transition. Contingencies. I found it. A legal document that hadn't been mentioned in the original letter I received, stamped with the seal of my grandfather's lawyer and dated nearly a decade earlier. The language was formal, convoluted in places, the kind of legalese that demands you reread each sentence 3 times to parse its true meaning. But the message, once unraveled, was clear. The inheritance of the Vale estate was conditional. The condition was not financial, not tied to taxes or upkeep or the state of the property. It was emotional, philosophical. It was, in essence, a final command from a dead man. The recipient of the Vale estate shall, within 1 year of receiving this document, complete the restoration and preservation of the painting known as Portrait of M, currently located in the main hall. Under no circumstances shall this work be removed, destroyed, or replaced. If the restoration is not completed, ownership of the estate will revert to the Merrow Creek Historical Society for redistribution in accordance with the Vale Family Preservation Trust. I sat back in the old chair, heart thudding, staring at the page in disbelief. This wasn't just a painting, Tim. This wasn't just art. It was legacy. And not legacy in the proud, boastful sense, but in the quiet, guilt-ridden kind of way that defines a man who spent his final years trying to rewrite a choice he could never take back. He wanted her restored. Not removed, not painted over, not forgotten. Restored. And now that I knew who she was, now that I understood what she meant to this family, I saw the condition for what it was. A confession disguised as an inheritance. A plea written in the cold language of contracts. And it left me reeling, because restoration wasn't just about cleaning oil and canvas. It meant facing her, every day, deliberately, intimately, until she was whole again. Until she could be seen as she once was, not as she had been remembered through the warped lens of shame and exile. And it meant bearing the burden of doing what my grandfather hadn't, honoring her, a woman who had been erased with such precision that her name no longer existed in our family's records. A woman whose eyes I now saw not just as paint, but as witness. The clause changed everything. Before, the portrait had been a mystery, a symbol, a memory. Now it was a demand, an obligation. And more than that, it was a choice, because I could walk away. I could ignore the clause, let the estate revert to the trust, let the house become someone else's problem, let her fade again. It was tempting. Part of me longed to be free of this place, of the cold and the silence, and the way it had begun to rewire my thoughts, twist my nights into sleepless spirals, make me forget what day it was or when I last spoke to another living soul. But the larger part of me, the part that had sat at her feet in the hallway, whispering apologies into the stillness, knew I couldn't do that, because if I walked away now, I would become exactly what my grandfather had been, a man who chose silence, who chose shame, who chose himself. And I had spent too long trying to unlearn that inheritance to fall into it now. So I began researching art restoration, not through the internet. I had no connection out here, and driving to town felt like entering a different world. But through the books my grandfather had kept, the guides he'd used to commission or critique works, the handwritten notes he'd left in margins, I treated it like a ritual, setting up a workspace in one of the unused parlors, lighting candles not for atmosphere but for light, for warmth, for the simple comfort of fire in a house so cold. I found supplies in the basement, canvases, solvents, tools too pristine to have seen real use, and began teaching myself the art of repair. I didn't touch her painting, not at first. I practiced on lesser works, faded landscapes, forgotten studies. I wanted to understand the medium before I laid a single brushstroke on her face. And in doing so, I felt myself drawing closer to her, not just a Miriam, but to the version of her my grandfather had tried to hold on to. I found old sketches of her hidden in portfolios, pencil studies of her profile, her hands, her mouth. He had drawn her over and over again, sometimes with painful detail, sometimes with such haste it looked like a desperate act to keep her from slipping away. This wasn't art. It was mourning, and it made my task all the more sacred. The first time I touched the portrait, I cried again, not because I was sad, but because I was afraid of ruining her, of misrepresenting her, of failing to honor what she had been. But my hands were steady and the work was slow, and in that slowness, I found peace. I repaired the cracks in the varnish, gently cleaned the surface, restored depth to her skin, clarity to her eyes. I didn't change anything. I didn't interpret. I preserved. And with each hour, I felt her coming back, not in a supernatural sense, not in some eerie, haunted way, but in the way a photograph can feel alive when you finally remember the name of the person in it. Her presence grew fuller, more defined. She no longer looked lost. She looked seen. And I began writing letters to her, pages of reflection and memory and apology, which I kept in a drawer beside the parlor. I told her what I'd found. I told her what I hadn't. I told her how sorry I was that it had taken this long. And each night, when I stepped back from the canvas, I whispered her name aloud, Miriam Vale, as if each syllable could rewind the damage, reclaim the history. The clause no longer felt like a condition. It felt like a contract between us, a promise, and I was going to keep it, not because he asked, not because of the legal weight it carried, but because I owed it to her, because she was part of me, whether I'd known it or not, because legacy isn't about what we leave, it's about who we remember. The longer I stayed in this state, the more I began to understand the nature of my father's silence, not just as a choice, but as a wound that had never closed, a scar he never showed but carried like a splinter pressed so deep into the skin it became indistinguishable from the body itself. I had spent most of my life regarding him as emotionally distant, a man who kept his feelings coiled tightly behind a weathered face and a carefully neutral voice, someone who never raised his hand but rarely raised his gaze either. There were no screaming fights in our house, no shattering plates or slamming doors, just a quiet, persistent restraint that governed everything, a kind of emotional austerity that I once mistook for strength. As a child, I thought he was simply a man of few words. As a teenager, I thought he didn't care. But now, sitting in the house he once called home, among the ruins of decisions that had reshaped our family like an earthquake no one had the language to describe, I saw the truth for what it was. He had been taught, long before I was born, that silence was the only safe form of survival. I began to search the estate not just for traces of Miriam, but for evidence of who my father had been before that silence settled into his bones. In the attic, behind boxes of brittle newspaper clippings and old luggage, I found a trunk marked with his initials. Inside were fragments of a boy I never knew, a baseball mitt worn at the edges, notebooks filled with sketches of birds and trees, a small stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Most were mundane, letters from childhood friends or school newsletters. But one stood out, a folded note, written on stationery embossed with the estate's crest, signed at the bottom simply with the letter M. The handwriting was younger, looser than the letter I had found in the painting's frame, and the note itself was short, just a few sentences. You don't have to agree with him. You don't even have to say it out loud. But just know I see you. I know you're trying. And I love you, no matter what he says about loyalty. It was the only surviving piece of written proof that my father had once had a sister, that he had once been loved by someone other than the man who had raised him with control and judgment instead of warmth. I clutched the note, like it might disappear if I blinked too hard. And in that moment, I could see it so clearly. My father, maybe 10 or 12, caught in the storm between obedience and compassion, trying to find space to be loyal to his sister without betraying his father. I wondered what it had done to him, carrying that conflict through adolescence, into adulthood, into parenthood. I wonder how much of his quiet anger, his distance, his deep-seated rigidity had been shaped not by what he said, but by what he had been forced not to say. And suddenly, all those memories of him that once felt cold now seemed unbearably tragic. Him standing in the hallway outside my bedroom with a glass of water he never gave me. Him watching me draw for hours without ever asking what I was working on. Him hesitating at the door when I left for college. His mouth opening just a little before he turned away without speaking. He had wanted to say something. He always had. But he had been taught, probably every day of his life in this very house, that love was dangerous when misdirected, that grief must be buried, that loyalty to the name mattered more than loyalty to the heart. I wrote him a letter. I didn't know if I would send it. I didn't even know where to send it. But I wrote it because the weight inside me had become too heavy to carry alone, and I needed him to know that I saw him now, not as the father I had judged for being absent, but as a child he had once been silenced before he could ever find his voice. I told him about Miriam, about the letters, the portraits, the claws. I told him I understood now, not everything, but enough to realize how lonely he must have felt, how impossible it would have been to be the bridge between a father who demanded erasure and a sister who had become a ghost. I told him I forgave him for silence. But more than that, I told him I wished he would forgive himself. That evening, I sat in the hallway beneath Miriam's portrait and read the letter aloud. I imagined him sitting across from me, not the man he was now, but the boy who had received that folded note decades ago, the one with a sister who whispered love into his fear and told him he didn't have to agree to be seen. I spoke her name again, slowly, clearly, Miriam Vale, and then I said his name, Thomas Vale, and I told them both that I would not continue the silence, that I would not pretend the wound wasn't real. The next morning, I returned to the study and began digging through legal documents again, searching for anything that might connect Miriam to public records. Birth certificates, medical files, school records, anything that had been hidden or redacted. What I found instead was a ledger. Inside were detailed financial records spanning for decades, mostly mundane. Contractor invoices, tax filings, donations to local causes. But at the back was a series of recurring payments marked only MV. They started in the early 1980s and continued sporadically through the mid-2000s. Each was made to an address in New Hampshire. The name on the account was listed only as C. Redding. I nearly dropped the book. Redding was my grandmother's maiden name. And see, that could have been anything, but in my gut, I knew it was her. Clara. My grandfather had been sending money to Miriam, but not directly, to a proxy, a way to care without confronting. A way to atone without apologizing. I copied the address down. It was likely outdated. She might not even be alive. But I had to try. I mailed the letter to my father the same day, along with a copy of Miriam's note and a photo of the portrait, wrapped carefully in cardboard and labeled simply, "This is what we forgot to remember." I didn't expect a response. Part of me feared he would see it as betrayal. But a larger part of me hoped he would recognize it as the first bridge laid back across a chasm neither of us had known how to cross. That night, I lit every candle in the hallway and sat facing Miriam's portrait. I told her everything I had learned. I read her letter aloud again, then read my father's note. I asked for her forgiveness, not just for my grandfather, not just for the family, but for me, for having walked into this story so late, for not seeing her sooner, and I made a promise. She would not be a secret anymore. I would tell her story. I would put her name back where it belonged, on the records, on the wall, in our blood. And when I finally stood to leave, for the first time since arriving at the estate, I didn't feel the weight of the house pressing down. I felt it exhale. Nights are long here in ways I never knew time could stretch. Not like in the city where darkness is diluted by streetlights and sirens and the muted hum of a million lives stacked one on top of the other. But here in this house, night falls like a velvet curtain and doesn't lift until the house decides it's ready, as if it's not just the absence of light, but a state of being, a separate realm where memory plays tricks and emotions rise like mist from the floorboards. Sleep, if it came at all, arrived in slivers. 10 minutes here, 20 there. Never deep enough to rest, never shallow enough to feel truly awake. I started counting things to stay sane. The number of ceiling beams in each room, the number of steps from my bed to the hallway, the number of times I whispered her name before the emptiness around me swallowed the sound. Miriam. I said it like a prayer, like a mantra, like an anchor to something real when the night stretched so far. I thought I might forget what my own voice sounded like. The house groaned in the dark, its walls tightening with the cold, and I learned to tell the difference between the sigh of an old pipe and the creak of settling wood, between the rustle of wind and the imagined sound of footsteps in a room I hadn't entered. I wasn't afraid. Not exactly. It wasn't fear that kept me pacing at 3 a.m. or sitting at the edge of my bed with my hands clenched into fists, eyes wide open against the silence, so dense it pressed into my skull like static. It was something else, something lonelier. Grief, maybe, or the way grief mutates when there's no one to share it with. I began to dream while awake. Not hallucinations, not visions, just flashes of thought so vivid they felt tactile. I would blink and see my father as a child, sitting on the steps outside the estate, holding a notebook, his eyes downcast, lips moving in some silent conversation with himself. I would walk past the portrait and think I saw her head tilt slightly, not because it did, but because I had stared so long and so often that my mind began to animate her into memory. I heard music once, a piano chord, faint and unfinished, so familiar it stopped me cold in the hall. I followed it to the drawing room, heart pounding, only to find nothing but dust and a half-lit candle that I swore I hadn't lit. But I didn't panic. I sat down at the old piano, ran my fingers along the yellow keys, and played the only piece I still remember from childhood, a melody my mother used to hum while making dinner. It was incomplete, off-key, but it filled the room with something other than silence, and for a few minutes, the house felt almost kind. I started keeping a night journal, separate from the others, just thoughts scribbled down between 2 and 5 a.m., questions, observations, fragments of dreams. I wrote about the cold, about how my fingertips had lost their feeling from handling paint thinner and brushes and photographs for so long. I wrote about my grandfather's desk drawer that stuck every third time I opened it. I wrote about the way time seemed to slow after midnight, as if the house remembered too much and needed space to grieve. And I wrote about the weight, not physical, but emotional, psychological, a dense, inescapable pressure in my chest that grew heavier the closer I got to finishing Miriam's restoration. As if the closer I came to honoring her, the more aware I became of everything she had lost. I wonder how she had spent her nights, wherever she had gone after she was sent away. Did she sleep at all? Did she write letters she never mailed? Did she look at the stars and imagine the home that had abandoned her? Or did she build a life out of spite and solitude and stubborn dignity, never allowing herself to look back? The ledger entries and the note said she had survived. But surviving isn't the same as living. And every night, as I stared at her face in the painting, I thought about how survival leaves marks just as visible as scars, even if no one's allowed to talk about them. My body began to betray me. Shaky hands, dry mouth, headaches that drilled deep behind my eyes. I started hearing sounds in the walls. Not voices, just a persistent humming, like electricity pulsing through old wires. I knew it wasn't real, but I also knew it didn't matter. The estate was doing what it had always done, absorbing emotion and echoing it back in ways that couldn't be ignored. I drank too much coffee. I ate too little. I forgot what my own laugh sounded like. But I didn't leave, not because I couldn't, but because I felt I wasn't allowed. There was something sacred about this final act of restoration, and leaving before it was done felt like sacrilege. I had come this far. I had unraveled so much. I couldn't walk away now. Some nights I sat with Miriam's painting until dawn, watching the shadows shift across her face, imagining her sitting across from me, listening as I poured my thoughts into the space between us. I told her about my father's silence, about the weight of expectation that had pressed into me my entire life without explanation. I told her about the anger I'd once felt, not just at him, but everything. My own failed dreams, my retreat from art, the way I had let myself become a passenger in my own life. And I told her that somehow, in this strange, broken house, I had found purpose again, not just in restoring her, but in remembering her, in saying her name out loud in a place that had once refused to acknowledge her at all. Some nights I fell asleep in the hallway, wrapped in a blanket. Her eyes, the last thing I saw before sleep, pulled me under. And when I woke, sore and groggy, the house would greet me with the same stillness, the same quiet weight. But I was no longer alone in it. Not really, because now I carried her voice with me, even if I had never heard it. I carried her story, her sorrow, her refusal to disappear. And that story gave shape to the silence. It gave texture to the dark. Nights were still long, still cold, still hard, but they were no longer empty. They were filled with her, with me, with the invisible thread that connected us through blood and memory and choice. And that thread, fragile as it was, held. IT happened on a Tuesday afternoon, sometime between the first sip of lukewarm coffee and the third hour of silent, concentrated work beneath the haze of a desk lamp too dim to truly chase the gray from the corners of the room. I had reached the final stages of the restoration. Her skin was clean, her eyes sharpened with careful detail, her dress darkened back to the color I imagined it once held in real life, a shade of deep pine green, almost black under certain lights. The edges of the frame had been re-glued, the canvas tightened, the varnish applied in delicate layers like whispers pressed into cloth. All that remained was a single, innocuous mark, a spot near her collarbone where the paint had bubbled and hardened into a texture I hadn't noticed until I leaned in close, my face just inches from hers. It looked like damage, something minor, maybe a flaw in the original materials or the aging varnish. But I couldn't leave it. Not now. Not when I had come so far. I dipped the edge of a soft cotton swab into solvent and dabbed gently, expecting resistance but finding instead something yielding. The paint lifted like skin from old bark, fragile and dry, peeling away with the delicate resistance of something that had never been meant to last. I paused, instincts prickling, and slowly, carefully, applied another pass. And that's when I saw it, not the mark, not the damage, but the edge of something beneath. Another layer, another color. My heart kicked. I adjusted the light, pulled out my smallest scalpel, and began to scrape, not to erase, but to reveal, millimeter by millimeter. The top paint layer gave way to what lay beneath. A line, thin and black, curved slightly like a letter. I cleared more. Another stroke. Then another. And with each pass, it became unmistakable. There was writing underneath the portrait. Hidden. Buried. The inscription wasn't on the back, as before. It was on the canvas itself. Painted over deliberately, then sealed beneath the official image like a secret locked under glass. My hand shook as I exposed the full sentence, heart pounding in a strange, reverent rhythm. It was small, discreet, barely 2 inches long, just above the line of her collar. But the words were clear, handwritten in a style I recognized instantly from old journals and marginalia. She would not be erased. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I could justify, my mouth dry, the cotton swab falling from my fingers to the floor. It wasn't just a message. It was a defiance, a confession, a quiet scream left in oil and pigment by a man who committed one of the cruelest forms of violence. Deliberate forgetting. My grandfather had painted over her voice, covered it with art, with beauty, with silence. But beneath that, he had left her truth, like a wound he couldn't let scab over completely. It was almost as if he needed to hide her and remember her in the same breath, to destroy her presence while also acknowledging the horror of doing so. She would not be erased. Not couldn't. Wouldn't. There was intent in that sentence. Resistance. A truth that had fought to stay even beneath layers of compliance. I felt sick, not just from the discovery, but from everything it confirmed. The painting hadn't always looked the way it did now. It had been altered twice. First created, then buried, then reclaimed. My grandfather hadn't commissioned the final version as a tribute. He had painted over something that had already existed, something that had said too much, something that had told a story he wasn't brave enough to face. And then, at the end of his life, he tried to bring it back, quietly, legally, with the claws. But he never stripped away the top layer. He left the erasure intact. And in doing so, he asked me to do what he couldn't, to finish what he'd been too ashamed, too proud, too broken complete. I thought about what that meant, that he had sat with her, brush in hand, and painted over his own daughter's words, that the man who had sent payments under fake names, who had hidden her letters in the back of drawers, who had locked away every reminder of her existence, had also whispered her truth into the canvas like a prayer and then sealed it in silence. I wept. There was no other response. No intellectualization. No art theory to hide behind. Just the weight of it pressing down from all sides. I wept for her, for the young woman who had written to her father begging to be seen, only to have her name become taboo. I wept for the version of her that had once lived in this house. The laughter, the arguments, the scent of her perfume in the hall, and how all of it had been reduced to a single portrait hanging where no one would speak of her again. I wept for my father, who must have known, who must have walked past this painting as a boy and recognized not only his sister's face, but the silence it demanded. I wept for myself, For all the years I lived not knowing that a part of me had been missing, a piece of family amputated so cleanly I never knew to grieve it. And when the weeping passed, when the candle had burned halfway down its spine and the air in the room felt still enough to split, I began to photograph everything. The inscription, the stages of removal, the paint layers. I documented it not as an artist, not as a restorer, but as a witness, because that's what I had become. The final link in a chain of memories stretching back further than shame allowed. I didn't add the inscription back in. I left it buried, but visible beneath a clear protective layer, like a fossil in glass. Something to be seen but not tampered with. A truth preserved in the very act of its concealment. She would not be erased. That night, I couldn't sleep. I didn't even try. I lit every candle in the house, every room, even those I hadn't entered in weeks. I walked barefoot to the halls, the floor cold against my skin, and whispered her name in every doorway. I said it aloud, said it soft, said it with reverence. Miriam, 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 like a blessing, like a spell to undo generations of silence. I thought about painting, about making my own portrait of her, not to replace the one that existed, but to add to it, a different version. One born not from guilt or shame, but from love. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. The emotion was too raw, the weight too immediate. But someday, maybe, when the house felt lighter, when the nights weren't so long, when I no longer wept every time I looked into her eyes. I closed the doors one by one, extinguishing the candles with breath and touch, until only the main hallway remained. Her portrait still hung above the fireplace, steady now, secure. It hadn't fallen since I began the restoration. It hadn't needed to. She had been heard. And for the first time, I felt the house agreed IT was the quiet that led me there. Not the creaking of floorboards or the moaning of wind through drafty windows, but the kind of quiet that feels too purposeful, too precise, like a hell breath, as if the house itself was waiting for me to notice something I had hidden too well for too long. It started with a seam in the wall behind the old bookcase in the library, a thin, hairline crack just barely visible when the light hit it right. I hadn't seen it before, not during my initial tour of the estate, not during the hours I'd spent lost in that room surrounded by my grandfather's shelves of catalog knowledge, but now, after the inscription beneath Miriam's portrait and the unraveling of everything I thought I knew, my eyes had changed. They had become trained for absence, for things hidden in plain sight. I moved the bookcase carefully, dragging it inch by inch across the floor, the smell of dry paper and cedar thick in the air, and behind it I found what I had known I was searching for, a narrow door flush with the wall, painted the same faded white, no knob, just a small circular keyhole that looked unused for decades. I remembered the small tin box I had found in my grandfather's study weeks ago, filled with labeled keys I hadn't yet matched to anything, and after trying 6 or 7, one finally clicked. The door creaked open with the hesitant groan of something in use being disturbed, and the air that escaped was thick with the scent of old oil, mildew, and time. I stepped inside and froze. The room wasn't large, maybe 15 by 15, but the walls were lined entirely with portraits unframed, stacked against one another, some leaning 2 and 3 deep. There were at least 30, maybe more, each rendered in varying degrees of completion. Some were detailed and lifelike, others rough, abstract, barely more than silhouettes and shadows. But they all shared one thing, a sadness, a weight that pressed on the canvas in the room itself. Like each face carried its own story of abandonment, silence, or regret. I moved slowly, reverently, as if walking through a cemetery of memory. There was a woman with copper hair and green eyes, painted with astonishing tenderness, her mouth slightly open as if she had been caught mid-thought. A boy of about 10 with bruises under his eyes and a half-finished hand, his outline smudged like someone had tried to erase him and failed. A man who looked eerily like my father but younger, sharper, staring out from the canvas with an expression I couldn't read. And dozens more, faces I didn't know, faces that had no names, no context, no frames, as if the very act of hanging them would have given them too much permanence, too much presence. This was the gallery of the forgotten, the ones who didn't make the family tree, the ones painted not to be celebrated, but to be stored. My grandfather hadn't just erased Miriam. He had made a habit of it. I sat in the center of the room, and let the weight of it settle over me. Each portrait was a life, a person remembered in silence, stored away like an archive of guilt. Were they all family? Lovers? Children born of shame or conflict? People who didn't fit the mold he had constructed so meticulously? I would never know. There were no labels, no notes, no records, just brushstrokes and eyes. Eyes that watched me not with judgment, but with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from being unseen for too long. I began taking photographs, cataloging each one, not as an archivist, but as a mourner. I whispered apologies as I moved through them, tracing their features, searching for similarities in jawlines or expressions, wondering how many lives have been shaped, stunted, or erased by this single house's need to appear whole. And as I worked, I realized something deeper. This wasn't just my grandfather's doing. This was a tradition, passed down, enforced, inherited like eye color or temperament. He had been the latest in a line of people who believed silence was a form of protection, that dignity meant denial, that history should be curated like a museum instead of lived like a story. And my father, he had inherited the silence. I had inherited the reckoning. I spent days in that hidden room, documenting, sketching, sitting in stillness among the forgotten. I brought a blanket and a thermos of coffee and made a kind of ritual out of it. Light a candle, sit in front of a portrait, ask it what it wanted me to remember. I don't believe in ghosts, not in the spectral sense, but I believe in memory, and I believe in the power of being seen. And in those long hours, I began to understand that these people, whoever they were, had never asked to be icons or symbols or lessons. They had simply wanted to be real. And the crime wasn't that they had suffered. It was that they had been denied the dignity of being acknowledged. I found one portrait that haunted me more than the rest. It was small, square, less refined than the others, painted in broad, rough strokes. It showed a girl, maybe 8, maybe 10, with tightly braided hair and a crooked smile. Her eyes were wide, expectant, as if she had just been told a secret. On the back, in faint pencil, with the initials Evie, I didn't know who she was. Maybe a cousin, maybe someone adopted or abandoned. But something about her expression stayed with me, clung to the edges of my thoughts like a forgotten melody. I placed her portrait beside Miriam's in the hallway the next day, not because I knew her story, but because I wanted to begin the process of restoring not just one name, but all of them. I started bringing the other paintings out one by one, not to display them publicly. They weren't ready for that, but to give them space, air, light. I cleaned their surfaces, repaired their frames. I whispered to them as I worked, telling them they were no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't a historian. I wasn't a priest, but I was someone who saw them, and that, I had come to believe, mattered. The house felt different now. Not lighter, exactly, but more honest. The creaks and groans no longer sounded like secrets. They sounded like memory stretching its legs after a long sleep. I found myself humming as I worked, sometimes a tune from the piano, sometimes songs I didn't even recognize. The cold in the rooms remained, but it no longer felt punishing. It felt like presence, like someone else was breathing with me. I thought about the people who would come after me. What kind of ancestor did I want to be? What kind of story did I want this house to tell? I couldn't rewrite the past, but I could refuse to bury it. And that, I decided, would be my legacy. Not the estate, not the paintings, but the act of remembrance. The gallery of regret would not stay hidden. Not anymore. Not while I lived here. And someday, when I was gone, I hope someone else would sit in this room, surrounded by faces that once had no names, and feel what I felt now. Not fear, not sorrow, but the quiet, steady weight of truth. Heavy, beautiful, human. There was a quiet moment, the kind that settles over a place not from stillness, but from the ending of resistance, where I stood before Miriam's portrait and realized she was no longer framed, not just in the literal sense, but in the deeper, crueler way that haunted her story since before I was born. She had been cast as something she was not, a disruption, a stain, a deviation from the family's supposed values, and that narrative had shaped every decision made about her, including the silence that had buried her name beneath decades of generational shame. But now, finally, her story was no longer confined by that frame. She was no longer the figure we whispered about in omissions, no longer the painted eyes we walked past without acknowledgement. She was a person again, a woman with a name, a voice, a history that demanded remembrance. And I knew it wasn't enough to restore her privately. It wasn't enough to understand her in solitude. The real work, the hardest part, was to reclaim her publicly, to tell the truth in a world that had grown used to the lie. I began writing again, not in fragments or midnight journal entries, but deliberately. I started with a long-form letter, addressed not just to my father, but to every relative who might still carry our name, those distant cousins and forgotten branches that had never set foot in this state, but whose silence, inherited or willful, had contributed to the erasure. I told them about Miriam, about the portrait, the letters, the hidden gallery. I described her not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman who had been wronged and who survived anyway. I told them the story of a family that had taught its children to value image over love, and how that doctrine had cost us something sacred, our humanity. I included photographs, carefully taken and annotated, of the restored portrait, of the inscription I had uncovered beneath the paint, of the other forgotten faces now brought into the light. I didn't ask for validation. I didn't expect closure. I only asked that they see her, that they say her name, that they tell their children there had once been a woman named Miriam Vale who had been cast out not because she failed, but because she dared to live authentically in a world that demanded submission. I mailed the letters from town, standing in line with a box of padded envelopes, feeling the surreal weight of time as the postmaster stamped them one by one. Each envelope felt like a small act of rebellion, a defiance of silence that had shaped us. I expected backlash, or worse, indifference. But over the next few weeks, I received a trickle of responses, emails, handwritten letters, even a phone call or two. Some were brief, expressions of shock or sorrow or thanks. Others were long, reflective, stories of relatives who remembered whispers, fragments, a beautiful young woman who had vanished without explanation. One cousin, a woman in her 60s, sent me a photo, a blurry snapshot of family reunion in the late 1970s. In the background, almost cut off, was a figure I recognized instantly, Miriam, laughing, her hand reaching toward the camera as if trying to stop the shot. She had been there once, on the edges, not erased, just carefully cropped. I printed that photo and placed it beneath her portrait in the hallway, not framed, just resting there, visible, real. The house changed again after that. It wasn't just lighter, it felt participatory, almost as if it had been holding its breath and was finally exhaling. The nights were still long, but they were no longer heavy. The sound of the walls, the shifting of wood, the pressure of memory, they remained, but now they felt like companions rather than burdens. Echoes, not ghosts. I hosted a small gathering at the estate in early spring, inviting the few family members who had responded with warmth and curiosity. We walked the halls, shared stories, examined the paintings. Some cried, some laughed. All of them touched the portraits, as if touching could make up for years of forgetting. In the gallery of regret, I placed a small plaque on the wall. It read, "This room holds memory, not shame. Every face here matters. Every silence ends here." They stood before in silence, and I watched as something shifted in their expressions, not disbelief, not discomfort, but understanding, a reckoning. Miriam was no longer alone in the house. Neither was I. In the weeks that followed, I reached out to the local historical society, proposing a partnership to preserve and eventually open parts of the estate for education. Not tourism, not spectacle, but remembrance. I offered access to the archives, to restored paintings, to the journals I had cataloged page by page. They were hesitant at first, unsure what to do with a story so personal, so raw. But the moment I showed them the inscription beneath Miriam's portrait, the energy changed. The director, an older woman with eyes sharp from decades of sifting through other people's histories, looked at me and said, "You understand this isn't just your family story, don't you?" I nodded, because I did. This was about every Miriam who had ever been written out of record, every daughter unacknowledged, every sibling forgotten, because their truth was too inconvenient to frame. The estate became a project not of restoration, but of reclamation, and through it, I found a version of myself I had never known, a person rooted not in guilt or confusion, but in clarity. I was no longer trying to solve a mystery. I was building a legacy, one where memory was sacred and silence was no longer safe, one where the act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, was the most radical and loving thing a person could do. Miriam's portrait remained in the hallway, above the fireplace, but now it was accompanied by a plaque bearing her name, her dates, and a quote from her letter. I still remember the sound of the piano on winter mornings. It wasn't a summary. It wasn't a justification. It was a reminder that she had lived, that she had remembered, that she had mattered. And as for the frame, it was no longer a cage. It was a window, a threshold, a beginning. She was never framed. She had only been waiting for someone to look beyond the paint. The day I locked the front door of the estate for the last time, the key felt heavier than it should have, its worn brass edges warm from my palm, like it had been holding the memory of every hand that had turned it before mine. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Leaving doesn't mean forgetting, and walking away doesn't mean you aren't still tethered to the ground you once called home. The house was quiet, not the haunted kind of quiet it had once seemed to hold, but the settled quiet of something at peace, as though it had finally exhaled everything it had been keeping for so long. The halls no longer echoed with the strange weight of unfinished stories, and even the portrait, Miriam's portrait, watched me from the wall not with sorrow, but with a calm that felt earned. She was still there, perfectly preserved, surrounded now by others who had once been stored in the gallery of regret, but now lined the walls with names, with stories, with the dignity of acknowledgement. I had documented each face, archived every journal, and worked with the local historical society to create a rotating collection that would travel through small museums and community spaces across the region, not as a cautionary tale, but as a conversation, a reminder, a history that refused to be quiet any longer. And I knew that long after I had gone, her face would remain, seen not as a mystery or a symbol of shame, but as a woman who had endured, a woman who had mattered. I packed slowly in the final days. Books I had read and reread, photos I had uncovered and framed, letters from relatives I never expected to hear from again, and sketches I had drawn at the estate of Miriam, of the rooms that had changed me. I didn't take much. The house didn't ask me to. It had given me what I needed, and it didn't need to be emptied to be remembered. I left behind my journals, stacked neatly on a shelf in the parlor, labeled by date and season, a record of one person's journey through memory and legacy. Maybe someday, someone else would find them. Maybe not. That wasn't the point. The point was that I had left them behind. A breadcrumb trail. A signpost that someone had cared enough to stay. The morning I drove away, the trees lining the driveway were heavy with green, their branches stretching above like arms forming a canopy, a tunnel of memory and departure. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and in the rear-view mirror, the house grew smaller, not because it was shrinking, but because it was releasing me. I didn't cry. Not then. I had cried enough in the months before. What I felt now wasn't sadness. It was gratitude, laced with something harder to name, a kind of gentle ache, like the soreness that comes after healing, when the skin is new and tender and ready to face the sun again. Back in the city, I kept to myself for a while. I returned to a world that hadn't changed, though I had. The noises felt sharper, the colors too bright, the pace too fast. I walked slower, spoke softer, thought deeper. I kept the photo of Miriam on my desk, not the portrait, but the candid one, the blurred image of her laughing at the edge of a family gathering, her hand reaching toward the lens. It reminded me of how easily history tries to crop us out, how quickly the edges of our stories are trimmed to fit cleaner narratives. I taught myself to notice the margins in other people's stories, too. The pauses when someone doesn't finish a sentence, the names that go unspoken at family dinners, the photos that are never shown. I learned that every family has its silences, and that the bravest thing we can do is choose to break them, not with confrontation, but with compassion, not with blame, but with truth. The estate never left me. I felt it when I passed old buildings with shuttered windows and wondered what stories lived inside. I felt it when I heard a piano chord and remembered the way she had existed in the sound, even after being silenced. I felt it every time I walked past a painting and wondered what had been hidden beneath the final layer of paint. I spoke at small events, libraries, college classes, historical societies, sharing the story of Miriam Vale, of the portrait that wouldn't stay on the wall, of the family that tried to erase her and the descendant who refused to let them. People listened. Some cried. Some nodded with recognition, as though I had named something they had always felt but never said aloud. After one talk, a woman in her 70s approached me with a shaking hand and said, "My sister came out in 1972. My parents never spoke her name again. I didn't know how to grieve her while she was still alive." I held her hand, and we stood in silence, bound by shared experience, by the ache of omission. In that moment, I understood that Miriam's story had never been just ours. It belonged to anyone who had ever loved someone the world told them to forget. I continued painting, though not professionally, just for myself. And eventually I did begin the portrait I had once imagined, my own rendering of Miriam, not copied from the original, but drawn from what I knew now. Her resilience, her warmth, her refusal to be erased. I painted her with her eyes closed, her mouth curved slightly, as if whispering something only she understood. And around her, I painted fragments of others, faces from the gallery, the child with braided hair, the man who looked like my father, the copper-haired woman, woven together like a quilt of memory. I hung in my apartment, opposite my desk, not in a frame, just tacked gently to the wall, raw and real. It was never finished. I left the brushstrokes rough, the edges uneven, because memory is never tidy, and healing doesn't need to be perfect to be whole. Years later, when I was asked to speak at an event for historical restoration projects, I stood behind a podium and said only this: we all inherit something. Sometimes it's wealth. Sometimes it's silence. What we do with it defines the legacy we leave behind. I stepped down, not because I was done, but because that was enough. The rest was not for speeches. The rest was for living. I still dream of this state sometimes. Not in nightmares, but in quiet scenes, dust floating in morning light, the feel of the piano keys beneath my fingers, the scent of varnish in old paper. In the dreams, the house is never empty. I am never alone. I don't know if I'll go back one day. Maybe, maybe not. It's no longer mine to live in, but it is mine to remember, to carry, to honor. And in that way, it never really left me. Because once you see the truth hidden beneath the paint, once you speak the names written in the margins, once you sit in the silence and choose to listen instead of run, you're never the same again. And thank God for that.